So Frida, thank you so much for joining us. Really happy to have you and have a conversation with you. I wanted just to start with just giving everyone a sense of who you are and your background. Where do you come from, and what brought you to this point today?
Thank you, Jack. I'm Farida Nabourema. I was born and raised in a West African country called Togo, located between Ghana and Benin on the West African coast. It's a small country of 8 million people, rich culture. But I myself, I have been an activist for many years. The particularity of my country is that it is ruled by the oldest military regime in Africa. The same family has been in power for the past 55 years. And as a result of that dictatorship, our people and as citizens have faced a lot of violence and continue to have our rights suppressed. So activists like myself have been trying to fight for democracy, rule of law, and justice. And in the past years, as part of my activism, I ended up funding an organization called the Togolese Civil League, which provides support in terms of helping advance the cause of democracy and rule of law in Togo.
And what have been some of the biggest struggles and challenges along the way to get to this point?
Multiple ones. The first one is the fact that the regime we are dealing with in Togo is extremely repressive. This is a regime that does not hesitate to kill opposition members, to kill activists, to arrest them, to torture them. As a result, for many decades, our organizations and our efforts of mobilization were done completely clandestinely, with people hiding and passing messages across to counter government surveillance and espionage. Eventually, with the birth of the internet, we have seen some change because social media helped us have a voice outside of traditional media that initially excluded dissident voices and allowed us to organize better. But unfortunately, across the line, the regime got better in acquiring resources to extend their repression to the digital space by purchasing spywares that they use to infiltrate citizens' social media platforms or cell phones or computers in order to monitor their conversation. So it became evident at some point that our security was no longer guaranteed in the digital space. So we started trying to find alternatives, not only to organize and communicate, but also to be able to raise resources and pass money through from the diaspora to support the struggle on the ground.
You mentioned a bit of my next question in your answer right now, but we're here to talk a little bit about Bitcoin and its use in your work. But even before we get to that, can we talk about the intersection of your work and technology, whether that be the internet, computers, mobile phones? How have these devices and tools been helpful, and how have they not been hurtful, but how have they set you back, or maybe how has the government used them against you?
It has its good and its bad, but at the end of the day, I believe that the positives outweigh the negatives. In the early 2000s, we used to send mass text messages to random numbers and call for people to act against the oppression and the abuses of the government. Eventually, thanks to social media, we have moved from using text messages to being able to record live videos, to do digital conversations in shows, to send messages via our devices, etc. So this has contributed massively in expanding our reach. Because back in the days, from our parents' generation, they used to write on papers, on multiple hundreds of papers, and make copies and then distribute pamphlets across the country. And this got many activists arrested because their handwriting was recognized by the government secret service. But our generation didn't have to do that. Technology expanded our reach, but also helped us reach targets beyond the borders of our country. A couple of years ago, nobody would even imagine that in Togo, we are enduring dictatorship, a French-speaking country, small nation that doesn't get much attention outside of of our world. But thanks to social media, we have been able to amplify our voices far beyond our borders. So, in addition to that, social media has bridged the gap between the Togolese living in Togo and those in diaspora. And we have hundreds of thousands of Togolese who live in diaspora and are in exile or have become refugees by running away from the dictatorship. And those people are still involved in the struggle for change because they want to go home someday or they want to offer a better country to their nation. So for a long time, it was difficult for those in the diaspora to fully participate in the organizing in the country. But with social media, people are able to do that without really feeling threatened. However, social media and digital tools are also provide an avenue for more repression today. Why? Because our governments invest millions of dollars in acquiring surveillance tools. As a result of this, we have some activists who are in prison today because the governments infiltrated their phones and were able to access their conversation. But the most dangerous part comes to the financial aspect of it. We're in a country where the government has a tendency of freezing the bank account of activists and dissidents just because they are convinced that if they have money, they will use it to fight them. In addition, they have gone as far as arresting citizens that donated money to social movements. Even those who live in the diaspora and came back were arrested because they were able to trace money they sent to someone who is in the struggle. So it caused a certain fear, and we could no longer use the traditional route of remittance payments because those were literally exposing people. You have to provide your ID to collect the money, and then you need to provide information on the person sending the money, as well as what the money is supposed to be used for. The number of documentation required were all systems in place that allow the government to control exactly who is receiving what and what is the purpose of receiving that money, and even how much money you can send or receive. So it became very necessary for us to find alternatives from passing money to neighboring countries like Ghana and then smuggling cash in Togo. We have now resumed to using other means like Bitcoin. You no longer have to pay the costly fees of sending it to multiple countries before the cash eventually gets home. And that is something very meaningful and very powerful for us because I believe in the coming years, we are going to be in situations where our citizens will be back on the streets like they were a couple of years ago demanding change. And they will need systems like this to help them continue organizing and keep the momentum until they manage to bring an end to their oppressors.
You transitioned wonderfully into the next question, which is how did you find Bitcoin in all this, and why? You mentioned a little bit why it's useful, but maybe expand on some of the reasoning you found it, and it's useful as a tool to you and your work.
Absolutely. I luckily found Bitcoin thanks to the Human Rights Foundation. And to be honest, I spoke to Alex Gladstone in 2018 when I was speaking at the Oslo Freedom Forum. Then I was sharing about some of the difficulties we were having in terms of raising funds and mobilizing resources for our struggle. And then he asked me if I have ever explored Bitcoin. At first, I didn't give it much a thought, but eventually, when he and I engaged in a conversation once again, I asked myself, why not try? And at that time, it was only something I was interested in as a tool. When he taught me about it, and I did more research to understand how it works, how to buy it and send it, and then I eventually taught members of my movement how to set it up and receive it. We were only interested in making it easier for us to access money, send money, and receive money. But then eventually, I tried to dive in more into understanding the philosophy of Bitcoin itself. Then I realized that it is something that is built on financial freedom. The idea that institutions and governments and people shouldn't have a total control of people's monetary freedom. And that institutions shouldn't have the power to prevent people from accessing their own resources, spending their own money. Then it also made me realize that we have countless of people in countries like mine. In Togo, for example, about 70% of the people don't have bank accounts. And for a long time, those people were completely excluded from the monetary system. It means they cannot access loans, they can never obtain things like student loans or mortgage and stuff like that. And then eventually they started using mobile money by using their cell phone numbers as their bank accounts. But recently, our governments have changed the procedures around mobile money. In the name of fighting crime, they now require citizens to provide IDs before they open a mobile money account. Yet we live in countries where more than 50% of our people don't have IDs. They don't even have birth certificates because we have a huge infrastructural problem. So by putting those things in place, they are making it completely difficult, if not impossible, for a certain group of people to have access to money and to be able to spend money. And this becomes restrictive in many ways, from accessing healthcare to accessing education or even providing better opportunities for their children. It becomes very restrictive.
In terms of the usefulness for Bitcoin, how you found it through HRF and Alex, but how have you found other people's adoption within your country? Is it challenging? Is it easy for them to understand? Do they, what does it take for them to understand the utility and it as a tool that might be able to help some of the work?
Absolutely. Initially, when we started using Bitcoin in our small activist community, we thought it was something that us activists were the only one using. Then eventually, a chain analysis report was published, I think, sometime last year. And then Togo was placed among the top 10 countries having the fastest Bitcoin adoption rate per capita. And I was very surprised. And I started digging more into that. And I realized that people were naturally adopting Bitcoin because it was solving a lot of their problems. For being unable to send money to certain countries, to our traders that operate in the region. In West Africa, for example, in Togo, the Togolese buy a lot from Nigeria and they buy a lot from Ghana. And each Ghana and Nigeria have their own currencies. And those currencies are constantly depreciating, which makes it difficult to traders to plan, etc. So people started using Bitcoin as an avenue for trade. And some others were exploring Bitcoin as a way of building wealth. Because initially, one of the surest way for people to build wealth is to buy land. But we also have massive land litigation issues with the fact that we don't have centralized registries. As a result, the same land is sold to 20 people and then they all end up in court fighting for the following 20 years. So people are looking for more secure ways of investing their money, keeping it safe from government. In Togo, we started an education program called the Gaye Academy. For us, education is key for two reasons. Number one, once people understand the power of Bitcoin and know how to access it, they naturally want to adopt it because everybody wants freedom and everybody wants protection from systems of financial repression. Number two, education also protects them a bit from people who have the knowledge and try to scam them or take advantage of their ignorance to make faraminous promises to them by telling them, let me buy you Bitcoin and then in 2 weeks you become a billionaire. There are people who fell victims of such scams and ended up thinking, unfortunately, that Bitcoin is a scam when actually it is people who use Bitcoin as an avenue to scam them. So educating people solves a lot of those problems, but it also makes people understand finally what money is and how money works. I felt a bit robbed of something when I started studying Bitcoin, and the more I was studying Bitcoin, the more I realized that there was never a time throughout my education process, from primary to school to university, where I was taught about how money works. And it is something so powerful, especially for those of us who use colonial currency. Like in my country, we use the CFE, which was imposed during the colonial era by the French government. That CFA requires our government to put 65% of our reserves, our gold reserves, into the French bank. And in addition, the French bank takes another 15% to guarantee what they call the conversion rate of our currency. The currency is pegged to the euro. And as a result of this, we have a lot of issues because we don't have a central bank that can decide to print more money or to reduce the circulation of cash in order to curtail inflation like some countries do. So we were never explained how money works and what are the impacts of the colonial currency on our economy. But by studying Bitcoin, I started understanding better how money works overall and realizing that the system we have in place in my country is not only abusive, but is not sustainable for us.
How large do you think the community in Togo is that understands what you just stated in terms of how money works and how Bitcoin might be, a tool to at least bring more transparency to how money works?
It will be hard to put a number on it, but in the recent years, thanks to the effort of anti-CFA activists, because there are 15 African countries that are using the same money, and in many of those countries, there have been constant efforts to push back. In Togo, for example, our first president, who we elected in 1958, was assassinated a month after declaring the creation of the Togolese franc by former soldiers of the French colonial army. And those soldiers have been ruling Togo for the past 55 years. So there have been attempts by some governments and some presidents in the past to change things, and most of them were killed and some were removed from power. From the citizenry as well, there are people who are aware of how abusive the system works. However, all of us activists that have been fighting for financial freedom and monetary independence did not really know any other alternative than to eventually hope that one day we will have democratic governments that will allow us to create our own currency. But then with Bitcoin, I realized that that procedure, we have started it over 50 years ago, and we are still stuck with those governments because they are highly militarized and extremely repressive. It might take another 20, 10, 30, or even 50 years for us to be able to set up systems that are democratic and accountable to the people, in which we can eventually choose our monetary system. Meanwhile, we cannot continue losing our resources, being impoverished constantly by being forced to use currencies that are not guaranteeing our economic growth. So that's when I started teaching and preaching about the avenue, the possibility of using Bitcoin as an avenue of monetary decolonization. And my point is that we don't have to wait to create our own individual currencies. Maybe our economies are too fragile to even attempt that. However, Bitcoin, I see it as the currency of humanity, which was not created specifically by a system to oppress another group of people or to force another group of people into using money that has not much value outside of their small borders. So by looking into Bitcoin, people are offering themselves a chance to use a currency that is global, that is adopted by all without distinction of their race or ethnicity or language or stuff like that. And beyond this, it also provides us to have the opportunity to have some agency by contributing to the protocol, by developing solutions that make it easier for us to access based on our realities. We still have a huge amount of our populations that don't have access to the internet. While in most Western countries, people easily acquire Bitcoin online, it is a challenge in our countries where peer-to-peer is the easiest way to acquire it because people don't have, not everybody has internet. So developing solutions that make it easier for people to access it, even when they have no internet, is something that could be helpful. And also making it possible for people to have the information and the knowledge in their local languages. Because translating the Bitcoin white paper, for example, in our local language, make people understand the philosophy itself and makes them partake into that effort. It is no longer an adoption of convenience, but it's an adoption that is extremely genuine, that is rooted in their belief in building independent monetary systems.
So you talked a lot about the virtues of the tools and some of the challenges, but maybe we just focus a little bit on the specific challenges of Bitcoin vis-a-vis adoption, people, but also the government as well. Like, where do you see the upcoming challenges in you as an activist and the general population using this tool, and how will the government react?
In Togo, so far, we haven't seen a government effort to restrict the use of Bitcoin. In other countries like Nigeria, the government took the extra mile to prevent people from using Bitcoin. However, we still have a huge issue in terms of access. Number one, people are not used to the platforms to be able to buy Bitcoin. In secondary, we don't have enough merchants that accept Bitcoin as a form of payment, which, and because people have a low income, when they buy it, they have to spend it. They are not in the, most of them are not in the business of acquiring it and holding it and expecting one day it will blow. It is money they are using for day-to-day exchanges or remittance they are sending to families for survival. So having more merchants accepting it is crucial to expand the circular economy. Number two, we have a strong problem with storage for two reasons. Number one, the major cold storage companies don't have any offices, or how do I even call it, representatives in our countries. So people cannot buy the cold storage unless they are able to order it abroad in Europe or in the US and pay very high fees for international shipping. So it makes it even more costly for people to be able to store their money. And when it comes to Bitcoin, people are a bit afraid of storing it online, especially in countries where the government can just shut down the internet, completely shut down the internet getaway. So sometimes, even with the VPN, you still cannot access the internet. People are afraid of having money in a digital space where, in case they just shut it down, you may not even be able to access your own money. So providing access is something that is extremely important. Creating a circular economy is also important. And this can be achieved by education programs, but also by providing incentives to local merchants, by educating local businesses and entrepreneurs about how Bitcoin could improve their businesses, increase their revenue. Because at the end of the day, they are into business to make more money. And understanding that Bitcoin can guarantee some form of returns, positive returns, helps them to that extent. The other challenge is that we still have a huge deficit in the number of African developers and engineers who can provide solutions to companies on the ground. So people are afraid of adopting something that they will be having issues, technical issues with, and there aren't people to help them fix those issues. So being able to train more software engineers on Bitcoin and Lightning engineers, it is something that is going to help more businesses adopt the payment. And this can also be achieved by partnering with universities to create programs, because we have countless of universities that have computer science departments, and we train thousands of students in computer engineering on a yearly basis. But you can barely count the number of those universities that have courses on building on Bitcoin and Lightning. So providing more support to the educational sector is also important.
Well, if an activist in Togo or a citizen in Togo were to come to you, or any activist around the world, and ask you where to start with Bitcoin and in utilizing this tool, how would you, where would you, what path would you set them on?
I have a lot who come to me. My group, we set up a digital course to make it easy for people who want to have an in-depth understanding of the whole thing. But beyond that, I teach them in a very easy way. I don't know if I'm authorized to say the names of platforms or not, but I can avoid that if you don't need to. But I teach them about which platforms work in Togo to buy Bitcoin. And those platforms provide payment systems that are in multiple range. They can pay by cash or with a Visa card or with mobile money, etc. Then I teach them about downloading a digital wallet or using a device. It can be another cell phone, or if they have the ability of purchasing a cold store where they could move their Bitcoin to after purchasing it. Those are the basics that I teach them. But I also indicate to them that they shouldn't trust people with their Bitcoin. You shouldn't trust, if you're not comfortable trusting your cash with somebody, don't trust them with your Bitcoin. The same applies, because Bitcoin is money. And I try to understand them that before and foremost, you need to know that Bitcoin is money. It is simply money. And once people get that, it's easy for them to get started. Then we have information For those who want to better understand back from the beginning what cryptography means and what blockchain means and why Bitcoin blockchain is the one we call people to be on, and why Bitcoin currency the one we believe in regards to the fact that we have thousands of currencies that are available today. Because there are people who come in and are like, I've heard there's this new currency that may sound interesting. Do you think I should buy that? And I'm like, no, I think you should just focus on Bitcoin. It is more secure, it is more powerful, it is more adopted, and you have higher chances of seeing the value grow, and you not losing your money.
Where do you think the larger Bitcoin community can help your efforts and your work, whether that be folks like Alex at the HRF or companies like ours or the open source developer community? Where do you see the needs for more work and more focus?
Um, the work comes in. I think there are multiple needs at multiple level. I believe for me that increasing adoption should be a movement that is driven by social justice activists, because it is at the end of the day about financial freedom, and social justice activists mostly fight for freedom. But then it should also be led by engineers who listen to people and citizens and understand their problems so that they can build solutions that solve those problems. The companies like yours or the Human Rights Foundation can help in this process by educating and equipping organizations, activist groups, citizens movements with tools to be able to use Bitcoin for their activism, but also resources to be able to teach people about Bitcoin. It shouldn't be something that is done only out of needs and convenience. It is something that should be done out of belief in the concept itself and belief in the philosophy of Bitcoin.
And you mentioned the developer community in Togo and maybe broadly across the continent. What are some of the other ways to support getting more folks from your country to be able to contribute to the protocol itself, not just be consumers of the tool, but to contribute to the direction as well?
It's a good question. I will say partnering with universities, creating training programs that allow already trained engineers to gain faster skills on how to build and how to contribute to the protocol. We have a huge interest that is already existent, but then people are lacking the information and the resources. There is also the fact that people from countries like mine, where French is the official language, lack opportunities because almost all of the opportunities to train on Bitcoin and Lightning developing are in English. All the resources are in English. So it becomes a huge barrier for engineers in countries where English is not the national language and people have studied their entire life in a different language. So localization is also important, and diversity matters at the end of the day, because the solutions, as much as it may seem that we all have the same problems overall from Togo to Nigeria or Ghana, there are some specificities based on each country's history and political context. In Ghana, for example, a citizen can open a foreign currency account in dollars. In Ghana, in Togo, you can't unless you have a special authorization from the Minister of Commerce and Trade, which 99% of citizens can never obtain. So the realities are also different from country. Increasing access to trainings and educations and opportunities of internship and work is also valuable and important.
Excellent. I think that's it, Farida. Thank you so much for your work and also your time explaining why this technology is important and also ways for the community to help and contribute. And we'll keep in touch and make sure that we're committing to some of the needs and sharing as much information as possible to bring everyone to the forefront as soon as we can and increase adoption. I agree with you. The biggest challenge is just that common front of increasing adoption and making it usable truly as a way to transmit money in a very free and transparent way.
Thank you, Jack. And I'm so sorry my voice sounds horrible. I have a cold, but I hope it was audible.
It was
So
amazing. It was amazing. Thank you.
thank
You're
you.
incredible. Thank you
Thank
so
you for
much.
being available and thank you for doing this.
Thank you.